Hi, everyone. I'm Paula Harvey of Tejon Ranch Conservancy, and we are now going to do a lesson on timed observations. This one is going to be fun. So what we're going to do is observe a group of animals and determine what we are studying. We're going to be using time to help us observe. So there's a number of different ways to model the things that we observe. And one of them is to conduct timed behavioral observations. That is, what are the behaviors that you are observing in animals? And that's a really interesting way to learn about an animal. And it turns those general observations that you do into something that's more scientific, it's more precise. It will create new kinds of interesting questions that you hadn't thought before, because it is a completely separate part of observation from when you're writing those observations that you notice. But measuring them through time is completely different and very, very interesting. So what you're going to be doing is finding a group of animals that you can easily observe. Most of the times it's going to be probably an insect. Birds are a little difficult to observe. You might be able to if they're hanging around the yard, but something that doesn't move around a lot will be easier to do it. So it could be ground squirrels if you have a lot of those. Lizards are great for that kind of thing. It has to be something that's really cooperative, something that's hanging out. So you have the time to do the measuring that you're going to want to do. You need an animal that's going to repeat repeated behaviors, and that's not going to be hard to do. Something that's less likely to run away or fly away. And you want to try and find animals that aren't so far off that you need binoculars, but also they're not so that you don't have to get so close to them that you'll disturb their behavior simply by being there. So those are kind of the choices that you want to make. So just in summary, here's what you'll be doing. You're going to record those behaviors of about 5 different individuals of whatever it is you're studying, and you're going to record it every 20 seconds. At every 20-second mark, you're going to make a tally mark next to each of those kinds of behaviors, and then you're going to graph that data. So let's take a look at the step-by-step procedures here. The first thing you're going to do is you're going to choose your animal and you're going to observe it for about 5 minutes. And while you're observing, you're going to just write down a list of the types of behaviors that you are seeing. Okay, then you want to really focus on making those observations, but don't explain those behaviors. So you want somewhere around 4 to 10 different categories of different kinds of behaviors. Take your time in really observing and seeing those different things. And remember, what you're looking for are things that you can time. And that makes it easier. That kind of puts it in a category of itself as you are determining what it is you're going to be studying. Then you create those categories in your journal. And then you're going to use 20-second intervals and time those, either with a timer, with your app on your phone. If you want to count to 20, you can do that. If you are doing it with other people, you can have one person who is the observer. You have one person who is the recorder, who's recording the number of each of those behaviors, and one person who is the timekeeper, who's keeping track of the time. And you're going to do these observations over a 15-minute period of time. Once you've done that, you're going to make columns for each of the behaviors on the y-axis, that's the horizontal axis. And then on the x-axis, on the y-axis, it's going to be the number of times you saw that behavior, the frequency. Be sure that when you create that chart, that whatever the behavior is that is the highest, you created that number high enough so that all of a sudden you're not out of room. All right, so I practiced this and I was studying the behaviors of monarch butterflies among the milkweed that I had planted in my garden to attract them. And so I did some observing and saw the different kinds of behaviors that they were doing. So if you look here, you'll see at the very top, I've got my metadata and I really describe where I was. I have several different gardens of milkweed on my around my house. So I wanted to make sure I identified which one it was. And then I also wrote that this is migration of the butterflies migrating west, which if you look at the date, you would know if you know anything about um, monarchs that they are actually migrating now from the area around Colorado to the West Coast to winter there. And so I noticed that there are behaviors while they're flying, but also behaviors while they were feeding on the flowers of the milkweed. So I listed them flapping their wings as opposed to gliding their wings. Later, when I actually researched it a little bit, I found that it's commonly called sailing, but it's the same kind of thing where they're flapping their wings and they're getting height, but at other times their wings are just straight out and they're gliding through the air. And then while they're around the plant and they're feeding, I wrote down feeding on the nectar, resting on a leaf, and notice there was nothing there. The day that I wrote this down was a different day than the day that I collected the data. So I saw at that particular time that they were resting, but the next day they never rested. And then interacting with other monarchs. And remember, I mentioned not to explain the behavior. So there were times when the monarchs would get up and they would get together and they kind of flutter around and then split up. And I could analyze that and say, well, maybe they were territorial and they're pushing each other away. Maybe they're mating. Maybe they're fighting. I didn't know what it was. I just put they were interacting because there was those periods of time when I could actually hear their wings hit each other. But I really don't know what that behavior was. So I just wrote interacting. Then when they were on the flower itself, sometimes their wings were together and so they were drinking nectar. And sometimes their wings were spread when they were drinking nectar. And sometimes actually only one of the monarchs did this, but he would, or she, I can't remember which one it was, would move from one flower to the next, whereas the other one just stayed on the same flower. So that was kind of interesting. So I just listed all of those behaviors that I saw over that 5-minute period of time. I only found 2 monarchs at the time that I was studying these. It's best to have 5 or more animals. You get a lot more data, but that was okay. If you only find 2 of something like I did, that's okay to do that as well. I did notice a few other things. Like I wrote here, I noticed a wasp was feeding nearby, and when it would get close to the butterflies, the butterflies would move away. I later identified what it was. And remember, we talked about the idea of going beyond done. When you think you're done and you go beyond it. I went way beyond it, and I'll show you that later. But I got so interested in what was going on that really I was studying what goes on around milkweed flower as opposed to just the monarchs. But the monarchs are the ones that I was measuring those behaviors. So metadata, observe for 5 minutes and list those observations. Then you're going to start timing. So you'll see you'll watch for 20 seconds and what are you seeing? So in 20 seconds, maybe I'm seeing them feed on a flower and maybe I saw them move back and forth and saw that several times. Or maybe I saw them flapping their wings when they were feeding. So I could actually mark different parts of those behaviors. And I did it for 15 minutes. All right. Once I've gathered that data, it's time to create my journal page. So I have this messy page that I just showed you where I was collecting data. It's part of my journal, but it's not the official journal page that I wanted to create. So remember what you're going to put in there, those 1, 2, 3s, which are what we're doing today. The ABCs, I notice, I wonder, this reminds me of, and when you're doing I wonder, you're going to come up with hypotheses. So I could talk about, I notice them interacting. Could it be that they are being territorial? And then I could try and answer those, maybe, perhaps. So that's what the ABCs are, and then the drawing, sketch, or diagram. And then part of those 1, 2, 3s will be that data that you collected. And we are copying that data onto the next journal page where we're going to create that bar graph. So let's take a look at the bar graph. Here I rewrote those behaviors. And in this particular time, the one about resting on leaves, I I just didn't even include it because that wasn't one of the behaviors I observed that day. So I just wrote down the behaviors I saw. So here I wrote while flying around the yard, and there were 2 behaviors I saw. And then while feeding on nectar on the flowers, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 behaviors I saw. So there's a total of 8 different behaviors that I saw. And then here's my frequency up here. You don't have to do it in the same format that I did it. But what I was doing was actually creating the bar graph directly across from my tally marks. So that's why it's designed this way, but you don't have to design it that way. If you turn it this way, it works just fine. Okay, so here's the number of frequencies that I saw of each of those things. And then I color coded just to make it look easier, just easier to look at. But I have all the tally marks over here as well. So it's all together. So this is an example. The graph's created directly across. Again, you don't have to make it exactly that way. And then here is my actual journal entry that has this information on it. So when you look at this, here's the metadata. And then here's my ABCs. I've got a lot of ABCs going on all over here. And I don't write things in order. I write all around. So what I actually do is I draw the picture and then I write around the picture. And then here's my measurements right over here. This is exactly the same. That other thing was the close-up. Now, here's where I went beyond. There were all these other things going on while I was observing these lovely monarch butterflies. And it had to do with this wasp and with this bug. And so I did some research on them and I did some more observations and I drew them and I found it extremely interesting. And this is the stuff that's go beyond done. So oftentimes you do the things that you've been asked to do and you're learning a bunch of different things. But if you go beyond what you learned, you're going to find even more amazing things. So for example, I found out about this insect. It's called a bug. It's a large milkweed bug, and it actually injects its saliva into the seeds in the seed pods of the milkweed, and it liquefies those seeds and it sucks out the nutrients of those seeds. But another thing that's really interesting about that bug is that it grows in 4 different stages or 4 instars. This is what the adult looks like. At the beginning of the slides, you saw actually what the juveniles look like. And another fascinating thing about it is it's also, besides the monarch butterfly being migratory, so is this guy. He is also. And an interesting thing about this wasp, it's really a gentle wasp. It's not going to sting you. You're not going to harass it, of course, but it's not, if you're an insect, you don't want to be eaten by it because it grabs it and then paralyzes it and buries it in with its eggs, and then it becomes parasitized by the larva of the wasp, and that's what all wasps do. But as a human, you don't need to be afraid of this. It's a beautiful insect. And that's it. So here's the bug I was talking about that I drew, and here's one of the instars. And instars are the stages of development. So these are the babies. These are the babies of this guy, and you can see some similarities and a lot of differences in them. So that's what you're going to do with this activity. Of all of the measuring activities that we've just done, this is the last one that you're going to be doing. To me, this was my favorite thing, was to do the timing on it. I hope you have a lot of fun doing this one as well. So thanks so much for sharing with me, and enjoy this, and I will see you with our next lesson. Bye for now.